Last Sunday, most of you were here last Sunday, and we talked about tradition and what a rich heritage we have in the church. What rich sacramental life we have and spiritual practices that have been handed down from generation to generation, writings, sacred writings, the scriptures, our order of worship that means so much to so many of us. And today we consider a life of the church, not only in tradition, but beyond tradition. You heard from the Gospel of Luke, when some were speaking about the temple. Now the temple, most of you know that the temple was the center of life for Jewish community. It's what gave life meaning, gave them place and purpose in the world. So Jesus said when some were speaking about the temple, how beautiful it was, how it was adorned with stones and gifts dedicated to God. Those gifts had come through the centuries, so they had meaning. They weren't just something somebody showed up with. They were gifts that had meaning. When some were speaking about the temple, Jesus said, "As for these things that you see," those things that gave life meaning, that gave them a place and purpose as a people, "the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down." Now we know that the specific events to which these scriptures refer, to which Jesus was talking about, have already happened. And the same is true for the proclamation of Isaiah. The things that Isaiah was talking about have literally already happened in history. However, human history, as we know, we're human beings after all, and we tend to fall into the same patterns, both socially and religiously and personally. What has been the center of your life? The place that brought you meaning and, well, God, Jesus was saying, just might be torn down. We haven't seen this level of cultural destruction in the church during our lifetimes, none of us. But 9/11 and the events of 9/11 and the realities of 9/11, sociologists say, was more than the explosion, as we know, of architectural structures in New York. Additionally, it struck at the heart of capitalism and corporate identity in America, and it sparked an avalanche of change in national identity. On a trip across the country several years ago, I drove by my grandparents' old farmhouse in Mississippi, only to discover ashes. It had burned to the ground. And I got out, it was evening, and so I turned the headlights of the car on and scraped through the rubble. And all that I found was a relic. It was a piece about this big, a little grid that came out of the ceramic grate of the old butane heater around which we gathered as children. It was the only thing left of a place, and more than a place, that formed my childhood memories. Who I am was developed in and around that house, and now it was gone. It's painful, isn't it? When we realize, either slowly or suddenly, that what we somehow expected would always be, that would anchor us and continue to define us, is gone. Simply is no longer. Phyllis Tickle, Episcopal ecclesial scholar and prominent writer on what is now called emergence Christianity. Phyllis Tickle points out that the church, that religion goes through a major upheaval, major transition and redefinition every 500 years. It's really interesting. She's tracked it back every 500 years. And we take our time with that renewal thing, I guess, doing it every 500 years. So she tracks the pattern. She begins with even the time before Jesus into Christianity's Jewish prehistory, beginning with the Davidic dynasty, when David was the king, the long-awaited king who would bring justice and compassion to the land. 500 years after that was the Babylonian captivity. Another 500 years after that, in the church now, was the Great Transformation. And then in the 5th century, the church changed with the Council of Chalcedon and the fall of Rome. 500 years later was what is known as the Great Schism. And most recent upheaval, of course, we all know, was the Great Reformation of 1517, when Protestant Christianity came to be. Before that, there was Orthodoxy and Catholicism. But 500 years ago, the Protestant church emerged with the Great Reformation. And here we are, 500 years later. And we know, because we see signs all over the place, that the church is shifting yet again. As you heard in our little dramatic invitation this morning, we even ask if it's dying. The temple of Protestant Reformation, Protestant transition that has developed since the Reformation is indeed crumbling. Faith itself is changing. How human beings perceive the world and God and God's place in it. How they and we express our faith in this world that is shifting ecologically and economically and technologically is changing at the speed of light. While watching and living in this crumbling of the traditions that formed us isn't easy. And we don't know where it's going to end. And it can be painful. We are, I believe, at least I think on a good day, blessed to be living in what is being widely termed the Great Emergence. Humorously, I think, referred to by Episcopal Bishop Mark Dyer as the church's every 500 years rummage sale. We're in a rummage sale. What's on the auction block? This time in which we live is religion's newest and next grappling with, questioning, redefining, reinterpreting the essence, the practices, the ethos, and the traditions of Christianity. What is happening? What is going on with and in and to the church in which we were nurtured? What human needs are shaping our spiritual life and our worship at this 500-year marker? And more importantly, perhaps, how might we be a part of deciding and determining the future of the traditions that we've inherited and that have formed our own religion? In fact, I think I'd have to say that we already are a part of the upheaval. After all, we bring different lives and different needs just because of the world, because the world is a different place. We bring an expanded sense of global culture. How many of you have a friend who was not born in the United States? A friend? Almost every single person. How many of you think your great-grandparents had a friend that wasn't born in the United States? Okay? That's because they too weren't born in the United States. How many people, your parents, have a close friend that wasn't born in the United States? A few of you. Wow, that's good. Our awareness of global cultures is unprecedented, as is our awareness, because we're living longer, of how things transition from technology that makes hunger relief within our reach to deeper relationships across traditional dividing lines of race and economics and sexual orientation, age. All these things are crumbling and are not divided anymore. But we're unsettled religiously. So unsettled have we become that many who once considered themselves unquestionably Christian now describe their active religious lives. Now, not saying they've left God. They describe their active religious lives with that now familiar moniker. What? You know it? Spiritual but not religious. It even has a nickname. SBNR. SBNR. Seriously. It's referred that way in that way in articles and in books. A major national survey published in USA Today in late 2010 showed that 72% of all millennials, that is Americans between the ages of 18 and 29, let me go back, 72% describe themselves as SBNR. But in spite of the shifts, American focus on spiritual practices and having active spiritual lives does not die. Spiritually, according to study after study after study, spirituality is increasingly important to people of all ages and classes and religious heritage or no religious heritage. Increasingly important spirituality. So, one temple indeed may fall, but others are springing up all around us. We see them. And people still need community. As online connections both testify and defy in some ways, all of us need connection. The defiance part is in our need for in the flesh, face-to-face, embodied relationships. Claire, my partner at first said that she wasn't interested in getting on Facebook because that's not how you have friends. You know, she really resented the fact that they were called friends on Facebook because friends, in her sense of need and sense of desire, were people that you could reach out and touch. And you could have dinner together and you could have long conversations about really important things. We need that. We need those in the flesh friendships, face-to-face. Interest in both spiritual practices and community is at an all-time high. University students all over the world flock to discussions about religion. Interfaith conversations are a hot topic and move into the realm of personal faith beyond philosophical theory. And even conversations about what being Christian means in today's world are increasing in popularity, in intensity, and in urgency, especially among young people. It becomes increasingly obvious that the temple of clear denominational lines, the cut and dried meaning of membership, the role of clergy, the structure of churches, where spiritual communities meet, rigid lines between religion and spiritual practices, this temple is almost gone. It is almost gone. So if we want to celebrate rather than bemoan what's happening in our world, if we want to share the goodness and transformative power of God in the middle of this shift, this 500-year cycle, we need to move. We need to move beyond what the church has traditionally been. We need to move beyond tradition. It's the church's hope. But I hope it isn't just biting our lip and bearing it. I hope it isn't just, dang, we have to do it, we will, kind of survival for survival's sake. Hopefully we're not out and bound and determined to preserve the good old days or support an institution just because that's what you do. We need a better reason to be than that. Fortunately, we have several. How exciting it is to be a part of building the temple that will serve next generations, to discover and develop new concepts, imaginative concepts and visions of what the church is, what it can be, and what the church does. And maybe put some stuff in the rummage sale as we're at it. Simply put, the church in America has moved from the center of the community's life to the margins. It used to be that the church was downtown and people walked to it and everybody went, unless you were Jewish, and then you went to the synagogue down the road. People who were respectable, in places of position, you knew where they went to church. The mayor and the city council president. You knew the church was where prominent people hung out, and we were right in the middle of this life of the community. But now the church has moved to the margins. Did you know that the church in America is actually growing? But the reason we say it's declining is because the white middle class church is declining. The church in America is growing. It's growing with immigrants. The worship is celebrated in languages that are not English. Most people don't have faces that are white. The church is growing in America. But it's changing. And we get to be a part of that change. This move from the center of the margins may just be good news for us. It may be good news because the church is much closer to the position that Jesus took in his ministry. Jesus didn't hang out with Pharisees and chair exclusive meetings where you had to have a ticket to get in. We know that. We know that Jesus hung out with those who were not respectable, who were on the margins of the culture. Maybe we're moving to the place where Jesus called us in the first place. And it's good news that we're moving to the margins, because most people who have lived on the margins develop a culture that includes a depth of character, passion for causes, strong inner resources, and they don't take themselves either too seriously or with a grain of salt. People on the margins are, I find, more multifaceted and interesting. Their stories, our stories, some of us, are gritty and edgy and filled with characters and situations of suffering and glory that surpass the stories of the middle-class white center. Moving beyond tradition, however, doesn't mean that we have to give up or abandon what gives our lives meaning and purpose. Rather, moving beyond tradition means that we expand the boundaries in a variety of ways. We may include ideas, practices, and even theologies from other faiths into our prayers and worship and daily living. It means that we get to have friends of a variety of spiritual orientations, and our conversations are open and curious and spiritually connecting. And I think maybe most brilliant of all, we can have these friends and conversations without either feeling a need to convert each other or having to dilute what is the power of our own spiritual path and convictions. That Sunday several years ago when we had the faith shared and we invited a Jewish woman and a Muslim man to come and be a part of our service, on her way out of church that day, Rita Mathis, in such excitement from the service, said, "This is the church of the future." And she was right. It's the church of the future. Moving beyond tradition means that the lines we once delineated of life's holy aspects from life's mundane aspects, those lines are either being seriously blurred or they're non-existent. This too is good news. But it still may not make it easy news, because it means change. Don't panic, though. We're already changing. We're evolving. We, Decatur UCC, are a place of prayer, questioning, and hope. We can bring our questions and our doubts just as much as we can bring our sureties and joys. That takes us a long way toward being this emergent church. You see, as meaningful as Christian tradition has been, it has also been dogmatic and authoritarian and exclusive and certain. And our world will no longer settle for such certainty. It seems contrived and pretentious in our diverse world of faithful, loving, spirit-seeking people. But one thing I believe, and that is that God is leading. The wind of the Spirit is blowing. The Scriptures assure us that God's creation didn't end with the origins of the earth and even the creation of humankind. The prophet announces that God is about to create new heavens and new earth. So captivating, so perfect, that the former things won't even be remembered. God's new thing is so filled with glory and wonder. Be glad, God implores. Rejoice in what I'm creating. I wanted to wait several weeks to tell you about a theme that the board and staff are exploring for our church in 2014. But it's too perfect not to tell you today. Our leadership met last week and considered our identity and our goals as a church for the coming year. We looked at what we're doing well, and what we want to do better. We went through our values and what's important to us, and then we said, how are we doing? What are we doing with that? Part of an interesting revelation of that day's work that we discovered, much to the surprise of some of us, that even though it's a real high value for us, that we aren't nearly as inclusive as we would like to be. We want to include spiritual diversity to a greater degree. We want to be in relationship with folks with a variety of spiritual practices and thoughts. We want to welcome singles and families, children and retirees, and have programs for each of those groups to use and offer their gifts. In a word, we want to build an inclusive church. That's an I church. Get it? I church. Okay, so that will probably be the theme for 2014. That will take us a long way toward being an emergence congregation. To determine what in our tradition is good and essential and worth keeping. And then to ask, what is excess baggage that is keeping us from being the people of God for here and for now and for the future? Imagine a church that is more committed to conversation than creed, to learning about God from the actual encounters not only of our ancestors in faith, but from our neighbors. Imagine a church that listens for a word from God in the prayers of a child, in a song and in a story, in both the music of the brook and the music of God, in the religious experiences from people from Brazil and Haiti, from Korea and Finland, and thanks God for the globalization that is a growing reality for us. Imagine a church where we're invited to be free to share our doubts and our struggles, our unbelief as well as our belief, and where we feel actually excited to speak about how God has met us and transformed us with grace. Imagine a church that is slow to draw lines between what is godly and what is not, between sacred and secular. A church that isn't so quick to make our lists of what it means to be Christian and draw the line in the sand. Where love and hope are both the character of our relationships and the ethos and attitude with which we live our daily lives and invite people to come through these doors. Do they walk in to a place of love and kindness? Imagine a church that includes anyone who wants to be a part of such a community of prayer and questioning and hope. Imagine this church beyond tradition. Even though temples fall and tradition fades, and the church changes, maybe beyond recognition, we can never lose what matters most of all: the love and presence of God, communion with Christ, and the company, the intimate company of God's people on the journey. God is doing a new thing. Change is in the air. Take a deep breath. Let's resolve to be a part, not of maintaining what used to be, but of what God is doing here and now. In response, I want to ask you a question. You don't have to answer it now. Whose thoughts would you like to hear? maybe somebody that's real different from you. Maybe somebody that's also involved in church, but a different church with a different tradition. Whose thoughts would you like to hear about spirituality? About being spiritual but not religious, what that means to them? About who God is, or about Jesus, or about the church, about prayer, about the role of other religions. What question would you like to ask? And of whom would you like to ask it? And I want to invite you to take just a few moments now. Get your bulletin out and a pencil or pen. Hopefully you have one. Write a question down on the back of your bulletin. Write it down twice. Tear one of them off. Take your bulletin with you so you'll remember what your question was and who you wanted to ask. But put the piece of paper that you've torn off in the offering plate. Email that person that you want to ask. Or sit down and talk with them face to face. That's even better. And ask the question. Don't formulate your response yet. Listen. See what you hear. And then respond. Respond thoughtfully. Not in a premeditated way, but respond to them. Create conversation. And then bring what you discover into your own spiritual life and into the worship of this community. Let it cross-pollinate. That is the emergent church. Cross-pollination and conversation and spiritual growth. That isn't about us just coming together, but it's about the other. Breaking down those lines that used to divide. When we do this, we're moving way beyond tradition. We're moving with the wind of the Spirit who brings life into ancient ways and who promises to be with us in this new day. Take just a few minutes in silence as you will and write it down. Your question and who you want to ask. Amen. Struck at the heart of capitalism and corporate identity in America, and it sparked an avalanche of change in national identity. On a trip across the country several years ago, I drove by my grandparents' old farmhouse in Mississippi, only to discover ashes. It had burned to the ground. And I got out, it was evening, and so I turned the headlights of the car on and scraped through the rubble. And all that I found was a relic. It was a piece about this big, a little grid that came out of the ceramic grave. Human beings, after all, and we tend to fall into the same patterns, both socially and religiously and personally. What has been the center of your life? The place that brought you meaning and, well, God, Jesus was saying, just might be torn down. We haven't seen this level of cultural destruction in the church during our lifetimes, none of us. But 9/11 and the events of 9/11 and the realities of 9/11, sociologists say, was more than the explosion, as we know, of architectural structures in New York. Additionally, it's a life of the church, not only in tradition, but beyond tradition. You heard from the Gospel of Luke. When some were speaking about the temple, now the temple, most of you know that the temple was the center of life for Jewish community. It's what gave life meaning, gave them place and purpose in the world. So Jesus said when some were speaking about the temple, how beautiful it was, how it was adorned with stones and gifts dedicated to God. Those gifts had come through the centuries, so they had meaning. They weren't just something somebody showed up with. They were gifts that had meaning. When some were speaking about the temple, Jesus said, As for these things that you see, those things that gave life meaning, that gave them a place and purpose as a people, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down. Now we know that the specific events to which these scriptures refer, to which Jesus was talking about, have already happened. And the same is true for the proclamation of Isaiah. The things that Isaiah was talking about have literally already happened in history. However, human history, as we know, tends to, we're human. Sunday, most of you were here last Sunday, and we talked about tradition and what a rich heritage we have in the church. What rich sacramental life we have, and spiritual practices that have been handed down from generation to generation, writings, sacred writings, the scriptures, our order of worship that means so much to so many of us. And today we consider